Court records from Oklahoma Territory tell of a woman whose very name made plantation owners fall silent. Sarah Granger, a name whispered with equal parts terror and fascination across 3 counties, stood trial not once, but 4 separate times between 1847 and 1856. Each trial involved the same peculiar charge, grievous assault upon the person of her lawful master. Each time, the courtroom emptied of women and children before testimony began, and each time, despite overwhelming evidence, no jury would convict her. The wounds she inflicted were too specific, too calculated, too permanent. 3 men lost their ability to father children. A 4th lost something else entirely. His mind, they say, though the official record lists only severe trauma requiring medical intervention. The authorities knew what she had done, the community knew, but something about Sarah Granger's case made even hardened frontier judges look away. What could drive a legal system built on absolute control to repeatedly release its most dangerous captive? The question of what made Sarah Granger who she was could not be answered by her appearance alone, though those who saw her never forgot. She stood just over 5 feet tall with hands that seemed too delicate for the cotton fields where she had spent most of her 32 years. Her face bore a single distinctive mark, a thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline, courtesy of an overseer's whip when she was 14. But it was her eyes that unsettled people. They did not carry the downcast submission expected of someone in her position. They measured, they calculated, they remembered everything. Sarah had been born in 1824 on a tobacco plantation in northern Alabama, the daughter of a woman whose name was never recorded in any ledger. Her first master, Edmund Hartwell, had been what the community considered reasonable. He fed his workers adequately, punished only when drunk, and occasionally allowed marriages among his property. Sarah learned to read by watching Hartwell's daughter practice her letters, memorizing the shapes through a crack in the schoolroom wall. This education, illegal and dangerous, would later prove essential to her survival. When Hartwell died in 1842, his estate was liquidated to pay gambling debts. Sarah was 18, strong and literate, qualities that made her valuable. She was sold to a cotton trader named James Wickham for $850, a price that reflected both her physical capability and what Wickham called her refined bearing. The sale separated her from her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and the only home she had ever known. The journey west to Oklahoma Territory took 6 weeks, chained in a wagon with 11 others, watching the landscape change from green hills to endless prairie. Oklahoma Territory in 1842 was a contradictory place, officially Indian Territory, yet increasingly populated by white settlers who brought their peculiar institutions with them. The land itself seemed caught between identities. Creek and Cherokee nations coexisted uneasily with Presbyterian missionaries, federal troops, and plantation owners fleeing depleted soil in older states. Towns like Tahlequah and Fort Gibson served as administrative centers where territorial law, tribal sovereignty, and federal jurisdiction collided in unpredictable ways. Wickham's holdings lay 15 miles south of Fort Gibson in what is now Muscogee County. 300 acres of cotton, corn, and tobacco worked by 40, 2 men, women, and children living in a row of 7 cabins behind the main house. The overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Walter Prout, ran the fields with methodical brutality. 20 lashes for talking during work, 30 for leaving the fields without permission, 50 for striking back. The punishment was administered publicly every Saturday after sundown, the assembled workers forced to watch while Prout demonstrated the consequences of disobedience. Sarah spent her first 3 months keeping her head down and her literacy hidden. She picked cotton with mechanical efficiency, never the fastest, but never the slowest. She learned which workers could be trusted and which would trade information for extra rations. She learned that Wickham visited the cabins on Tuesday nights when his wife traveled to Fort Gibson to visit her sister. She learned that Prout preferred the younger women, the ones who had not yet developed the hollow-eyed resignation that came with years of such attention. She also learned that Wickham's wife, Charlotte, knew everything that happened on the plantation, but had long since stopped caring. Charlotte Wickham had been a Charleston belle once, daughter of a shipping magnate, educated in French and piano. Now she was 34, childless and sustained by laudanum and the pretense that her husband's nocturnal wanderings were merely inspections of the property. She spent her days in the parlor playing the same Chopin nocturne over and over until the notes seemed to bleed into the walls. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late November 1008, 142, 5 months after Sarah's arrival. Wickham appeared at her cabin door just after 10 o'clock, when most of the exhausted workers had collapsed into sleep. He carried no lamp. He knew the path too well. Sarah was awake, had been awake, because Tuesday nights had a particular quality of silence. The other women in the cabin did not move when Wickham entered. They did not acknowledge his presence. This was the unspoken rule. You pretended not to see, not to hear, not to know. Wickham stood over Sarah's pallet for a long moment. She could smell the whiskey on him mixed with tobacco and the pomade he used on his hair. When he reached down and touched her shoulder, she did not flinch. She simply said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'll kill you if you touch me again." He laughed. The sound was soft, almost fond, as if she had told a clever joke. His hand moved from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there, a reminder of the power differential, the absolute nature of his ownership. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, though witnesses later struggled to describe the sequence of events. Sarah's hand, which had been hidden beneath her thin blanket, emerged holding something metallic. There was a brief, violent motion. Wickham made a sound, not quite a scream, more like all the air leaving his lungs at once, and staggered backward, colliding with the cabin wall. Blood soaked through his trousers with shocking speed. Sarah stood and walked past him out into the November night, still holding the cotton knife she had stolen from the gin house 2 weeks earlier. She walked directly to the main house, climbed the steps to the porch, and knocked on the door with the calm precision of someone delivering an expected message. Charlotte Wickham answered, still dressed despite the late hour, her eyes glazed with opium and something that might have been curiosity. Sarah held out the bloodied knife, handle first, and spoke clearly. "Your husband tried to force himself on me. I've injured him. He's in cabin 4. He'll need a doctor." Then she sat down on the porch steps and waited for whatever came next. What came next was Dr. Theodore Gaines, roused from sleep at midnight and riding 14 miles through darkness to attend to an injury whose nature he refused to describe in detail. Gaines arrived to find Wickham barely conscious, his wife sitting in the parlor still playing that same nocturne, and Sarah Granger sitting on the porch with her hands folded in her lap as if attending a church service. The medical details entered the official record only as severe trauma to the gentleman's person, rendering future marital relations inadvisable. In less delicate terms, shared in whispers between doctors and lawyers over the following weeks, Sarah had castrated James Wickham with a 3-inch cotton knife, the cut so clean and precise that Gaines initially thought she must have had surgical training. The blade had removed both testicles with what he described in his private journal as remarkable anatomical knowledge. Wickham survived physically. He spent 6 weeks recovering in his bedroom while Charlotte continued her piano practice downstairs, the mechanical repetition of those same 16 measures serving as the household's only acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. Prout ran the plantation in Wickham's absence, his punishments growing more severe, his temper shorter, but he did not touch Sarah. Nobody touched Sarah. The legal question of what to do with her became Oklahoma Territory's most uncomfortable conversation. Territorial law was clear. A slave who struck a master could be executed. A slave who caused permanent injury to a master should be executed. But the circumstances Wickham's nocturnal visit, the location of the injury, the fact that Sarah had immediately surrendered herself, created complications no one wanted to address publicly. The territorial judge, Samuel Beringer, was a Kentucky transplant who had spent 20 years navigating the impossible contradictions of frontier justice. He had presided over land disputes between Cherokee Nation and white settlers, treaty violations, murder cases where tribal and federal law offered opposing verdicts. But Sarah Granger's case presented something different, a moral question disguised as a legal one. Beringer interviewed Sarah privately in the Fort Gibson courthouse, a conversation never officially transcribed but later recounted to his clerk. She answered his questions with disturbing calm. Yes, she had taken the knife 2 weeks prior, anticipating Wickham's eventual visit. Yes, she knew the anatomy well enough to ensure the injury would be permanent. No, she felt no remorse. When Beringer asked why she had chosen such a specific punishment, her answer chilled him. I wanted to make sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. The trial lasted 1 day. Wickham did not attend. Could not attend, his physician claimed, though the truth was simpler. He could not face a courtroom where the details of his injury would become public record. Brute testified that Sarah had always been difficult, prone to insolent behavior. Dr. Gaines testified to the nature and severity of the injury. Charlotte Wickham did not testify at all, though she sat in the gallery throughout, her expression unreadable. The defense, such as it was, came from an unexpected source. A Creek tribal delegate named William Harjo stood and argued that under tribal law, which technically still applied to crimes committed in Indian Territory, Sarah's actions constituted self-defense against sexual assault. His presence was irregular, possibly illegal, and definitely unprecedented, but Beringer allowed him to speak. The jury of 12 white men deliberated for 7 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Territorial prosecutors demanded a retrial. Plantation owners from 3 counties sent letters of outrage. A Baptist minister published a sermon in the Fort Gibson newspaper, warning that acquitting Sarah would encourage rebellion and chaos among the servile population. But Beringer stood by the verdict, and Sarah returned to Wickham's plantation, where she was immediately sold. Her new owner was Marcus Sheffield, a widower who operated a smaller farm 30 miles west. The sale price was $600, $250 less than Wickham had paid, reflecting what Sheffield called her diminished value due to criminal tendencies. Sheffield had a reputation as a reasonable master, a man who attended Presbyterian services every Sunday and occasionally allowed his workers to earn small wages for extra tasks. Sarah had been on Sheffield's property for 4 months when she cut him too. The pattern, once established, became impossible to ignore, though many tried desperately to ignore it. Sheffield's injury occurred under circumstances almost identical to Wickham's: a late-night visit to the cabins, an attempted assault, Sarah's swift and anatomically precise response. This time, she used a straight razor she had stolen from Sheffield's own shaving kit, discovered hidden beneath his bed during a rotation cleaning the main house. Sheffield, unlike Wickham, survived his injuries with somewhat better health. Dr. Gaines, called once again to attend to an undisclosed trauma, noted in his journal that the damage was severe, but not entirely catastrophic. Sheffield retained some function, though he would never father the children he had been discussing with potential second wives just weeks before the incident. The second trial drew a larger crowd. People traveled from as far as Tahlequah to watch, sensing that Sarah Granger's case had become something more than a legal proceeding. It was a referendum on questions the territory did not want to ask itself. How much violence was justified in self-defense? Could property defend itself against its owner? What happened when the law's absolute positions encountered situations that defied absolute answers? This time, Sarah testified. Beringer allowed it over the prosecutor's furious objections, and for 2 hours she described her life with a clarity that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. She spoke of being sold away from her mother at 18. She described Wickham's pattern of Tuesday night visits, the way the other women in the cabin had learned to become invisible, to pretend a sleep so complete they might as well have been dead. She explained with unsettling calm that after Wickham she had assumed correctly, it turned out, that her reputation would protect her from future assaults. I thought, she said, looking directly at the jury, that once a man knew what I was capable of, he would choose differently. I was wrong about that. Mr. Sheffield knew exactly what happened to Mr. Wickham. He bought me anyway. The prosecutor, a red-faced man named Harrison Tate, demanded to know if she felt any remorse. Sarah's answer would be quoted in newspapers as far east as Richmond. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret defending myself. The second jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned the same verdict, not guilty. Sheffield sold her immediately, this time for $420. The declining price reflected what everyone in Oklahoma Territory now knew. Buying Sarah Granger meant accepting certain risks. Her next owner, Elias Drummond, apparently believed himself immune to those risks. He operated a cotton gin and small mill near the Canadian River, employed 3 other workers, and considered himself a progressive master because he allowed his people to marry and maintain small garden plots. Drummond lasted 9 months before Sarah cut him. Same pattern, same outcome. A late night visit, an attempted assault, a precise injury that ended his reproductive capability. This time, she used a paring knife from the kitchen, its edge honed to surgical sharpness on the millstone. Dr. Gaines, summoned for the 3rd time to treat injuries he found increasingly disturbing, began keeping detailed notes about the consistency of Sarah's technique. In his private journal, he wrote, "She possesses knowledge of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical student. How she acquired this knowledge, I cannot fathom." The 3rd trial drew national attention. Abolitionist newspapers in Boston published editorials praising Sarah's resistance. Pro-slavery publications called for her immediate execution, arguing that 3 separate assaults proved premeditation and malice. A delegation of plantation owners petitioned the territorial governor to intervene, claiming that Sarah's continued freedom endangered the very fabric of civilized society. But the pattern held. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite Drummond's testimony, despite the prosecutor bringing 3 separate doctors to describe the injuries in clinical detail, the jury acquitted her. This time the deliberation took 15 hours, and 2 jurors later admitted to a newspaper that they believed Sarah was guilty under the law, but could not bring themselves to convict her. Drummond did not sell Sarah. He freed her. The manumission papers filed in December 1008, 151 cited irreconcilable differences in temperament, and included a clause forbidding Sarah from returning to Muscogee County. He paid her $75, a year's wages for skilled labor, and arranged transportation to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where a small free black community had established itself along the river. Sarah lived in Fort Smith for 3 years. She worked as a seamstress, earning enough to rent a small room above a dry goods store. She learned to read and write with greater fluency, attending evening classes taught by a Quaker schoolteacher who asked no questions about her past. She might have remained there, building a quiet life far from the events that made her name whispered with fear across Oklahoma Territory. But in May 1854, she returned. She walked back across the border into Indian Territory, traveled the 43 miles to Fort Gibson, and presented herself at the courthouse. She wanted to testify at a trial, not her own, but that of another woman accused of assaulting her master under similar circumstances. The woman Sarah wanted to defend was named Hannah, no surname recorded, 19 years old, accused of striking her master with a fire poker after he forced entry to her cabin. Hannah's master had survived with a broken collarbone and severe bruising. Unlike Sarah's cases, which involved clear patterns of attempted assault, Hannah's defense was less certain. The master claimed he had been checking on reports of illness, that Hannah had attacked without provocation. Sarah's appearance in the courtroom caused immediate controversy. Judge Beringer, now 63 and increasingly weary of Oklahoma Territory's impossible contradictions, initially refused to allow her testimony. She was not a witness to the events in question. She had no legal standing in the case, but Sarah had anticipated these objections. She brought documents, 4 years of correspondence with other women across 3 territories, letters describing similar incidents, patterns of assault and retaliation, the legal outcomes that followed. She had been collecting these accounts since her arrival in Fort Smith, using her literacy and her wages to maintain a network of information that few people knew existed. Some letters came from free women. Many came from those still enslaved, smuggled out through networks Sarah had cultivated with quiet persistence. Beringer reviewed the correspondence in his chambers. What he read disturbed him deeply enough that he made an unprecedented decision. He would allow Sarah to testify not as a fact witness, but as what he called an expert in matters of self-defense against sexual assault. The prosecution objected violently. The Territorial Attorney General threatened to file a complaint against Beringer with the federal judiciary. The judge did not care anymore. He was dying. Everyone knew it, though the official diagnosis would not come for another year, and he had spent 2 decades watching the legal system bend itself into impossible shapes to avoid asking the questions that mattered most. Sarah testified for 3 days. She described the pattern she had documented, the time of night assaults typically occurred, the excuses masters gave for visiting the cabins, the way communities of enslaved people developed warning systems and protective strategies. She explained the anatomy of self-defense, why certain injuries were more effective deterrents than others, how precision mattered when physical strength was unequal. The prosecutor, the same Harrison Tate who had failed to convict Sarah 3 times, tried repeatedly to get her to admit premeditation, to acknowledge that she had planned these attacks in advance. Each time Sarah gave the same answer, "I prepared for the possibility of needing to defend myself. That's not the same as planning to attack someone." Hannah was acquitted. The verdict came after 19 hours of deliberation. The jury deadlocked multiple times before finally agreeing. The foreman later told a newspaper that Sarah's testimony had been the deciding factor, not because it proved Hannah's innocence, but because it made us understand things we'd preferred not to think about. Sarah's return to Oklahoma Territory triggered something unexpected. Other women began seeking her out. They came at night, in secret, sometimes traveling 20 or 30 miles to speak with her. They brought questions about protecting themselves, about the legal consequences of resistance, about whether Beringer's courtroom represented a real change or merely a temporary aberration. Sarah answered their questions with the same calm precision she brought to everything. She taught them anatomy, not from books, which she could not safely carry, but from memory and diagrams she drew in dirt or ash. She explained which injuries were most effective, which left the least room for retaliation, which could be defended in court as proportionate response to assault. She never encouraged violence. She simply provided information, then let each woman decide for herself what to do with that knowledge. The plantation owners noticed, of course they noticed. Between 1854 and 1856, 9 separate incidents occurred across Oklahoma and Arkansas territories, cases where enslaved women injured masters or overseers who had attempted assault. Not all the injuries were as severe as Sarah's signature technique, but the pattern was unmistakable, precise, calculated, aimed at specific anatomical targets designed to end reproductive capability. A group of 23 plantation owners formed what they called the Territorial Property Protection Committee. They hired a lawyer from Richmond, Virginia, a specialist in what was euphemistically termed servile insurrection law. His name was Cornelius Vance. and he had successfully prosecuted dozens of cases involving slave rebellions and resistance. He came to Oklahoma Territory with one goal: to find a legal mechanism to charge Sarah Granger with something that would stick. Vance could not charge her with the original assaults. She had been acquitted, and double jeopardy protected her. He could not charge her with teaching reading and writing because she was a free woman now, beyond those restrictions. But he found something else: conspiracy to commit mayhem. It was an obscure statute, rarely used, based on English common law from the 1600s. The charge did not require proof that Sarah had directly participated in any attack, only that she had provided knowledge and encouragement that led to injuries. The fourth trial began in August 1856. This time, the prosecution called 17 witnesses: masters who had been injured, overseers who testified to seeing Sarah meeting with women who later committed assaults, even one woman who claimed Sarah had explicitly instructed her on where to cut. The courtroom was packed. Federal marshals stood guard, anticipating violence. Judge Beringer, visibly frail now, his hands shaking as he held his gavel, presided over what everyone knew would be his final significant case. Sarah's defense team, 3 lawyers from the newly formed Oklahoma Territorial Bar Association who had volunteered their services, argued that teaching self-defense could not constitute conspiracy. They brought medical experts who testified that the injuries, while severe, were rarely life-threatening. They presented evidence that every woman who had been charged following these incidents had been acquitted on grounds of self-defense. But Vance was skilled. He reframed the question brilliantly. Wasn't there a difference between spontaneous self-defense and calculated, premeditated action? Didn't Sarah's lessons constitute planning? Didn't the consistency of the injuries across multiple incidents suggest coordination rather than individual desperate acts? The testimony revealed something that horrified the prosecution even as they presented it. Sarah had not just been teaching anatomy, she had been documenting everything. In a rented room above a boarding house in Fort Gibson, investigators found 47 letters, 6 journals, and detailed records of assaults, legal proceedings, and outcomes across 5 territories. Sarah had been building a comprehensive archive of resistance, a record of what worked legally and what did not, which judges were sympathetic and which prosecutors could be outmaneuvered. It was, in essence, a handbook for resistance, not a call for rebellion or violence, but a careful, methodical guide to self-defense and the legal strategies that might protect those who defended themselves. Some pages contained medical drawings. Others held transcripts of legal arguments that had succeeded in court. One journal documented the names and outcomes of 43 women who had been charged with assaulting their masters. 37 had been acquitted, 4 convicted of lesser charges, 2 executed. Vance held up these documents during his closing argument. This, he said, is not spontaneous self-defense. This is organized resistance. This is a deliberate campaign to undermine the fundamental structure of our society. Sarah's lead attorney, a young man named Robert Chenoweth, who had moved to Oklahoma Territory specifically to challenge slavery through legal channels, stood for his closing statement. He spoke for 2 hours, his words later preserved in court transcripts that abolitionists would reprint and distribute for decades. Gentlemen of the jury, he said, you have heard the prosecution describe a conspiracy. I ask you to consider what kind of conspiracy requires no secrecy, no hidden meetings, no coded messages, because it consists entirely of teaching women how to protect themselves from assault. Mr. Vance calls this organized resistance. I call it the natural consequence of a system that provides no other protection. Sarah Granger did not create the need for this knowledge. That need existed long before she began documenting it. She simply gave women the information they needed to survive. The jury deliberated for 4 days. During that time, Fort Gibson existed in a state of suspended tension. Federal troops patrolled the streets anticipating riots. Plantation owners from across the territory congregated in hotels comparing notes on workers who had become difficult since Sarah's return. Meanwhile, a group of free black residents and sympathetic whites organized a continuous presence outside the courthouse, waiting silently for the verdict. Judge Beringer used those 4 days to write his own final statement, not a legal document, but a personal letter to his daughter in Philadelphia. The letter survived in family archives and was eventually published in 1889. In it, he wrote, "I have presided over hundreds of cases in my 20 years on this bench. I have sentenced men to hang, dissolved marriages, adjudicated property disputes worth thousands of dollars. But none of those cases required me to confront the central question that Sarah Granger's trials have forced upon this territory. Can a legal system built on absolute property rights acknowledge that some forms of property have the right to defend themselves? We have constructed an edifice of law that depends on certain people being things rather than humans, and then we act shocked when those people remind us they are, in fact, human. Sarah Granger is guilty of only one crime, refusing to accept the premise that her body belongs to anyone but herself. The letter was never sent." Beringer died of heart failure on the third day of jury deliberation, collapsing in his chambers while reviewing case law. His death shocked the territory. He had been ill for months, but his presence had seemed permanent, as fixed as the courthouse itself. The trial was suspended for 3 days of mourning, then resumed under Judge William Patterson, a younger man with significantly less patience for legal complexity. When the jury finally returned, their foreman looked exhausted. He read the verdict in a voice barely audible beyond the first row. Not guilty on all charges, but he did not stop there. In an unprecedented addition to the standard verdict, he read a statement the jury had collectively written. "We find the defendant not guilty of conspiracy because we cannot in good conscience criminalize the act of teaching women to protect themselves from assault. However, we acknowledge the concerns raised by the prosecution regarding the organization and documentation of this knowledge. We therefore recommend that territorial authorities establish clear legal protections for enslaved persons against sexual assault by their masters, rendering such self-defense instruction unnecessary." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The jury statement was legally meaningless. Juries decided facts, not policy, but its implications were explosive. They had essentially declared that the problem was not Sarah's actions, but the system that made her actions necessary. Vance immediately filed an appeal with territorial authorities, arguing that the jury had exceeded its mandate. The Territorial Property Protection Committee announced a reward of $500 for information leading to Sarah's conviction on any charge. Several newspapers published editorials calling for her exile or arrest on vagrancy charges, but something had shifted. The consensus that had previously existed among Oklahoma Territory's white population, that the system itself was beyond question, had fractured. Presbyterian ministers began preaching sermons about moral complexity in an immoral institution. The territorial legislature received petitions from women's groups in Fort Smith and Tahlequah asking for exactly what the jury had recommended: legal protections against assault. Nothing came of these petitions. The territorial government, dominated by plantation interests, had no intention of undermining the property rights that formed the foundation of its economy, but the conversation had changed. Sarah Granger's case had forced questions into the open that could no longer be completely suppressed. Sarah herself seemed oddly detached from the controversy swirling around her. She continued living in Fort Gibson, working as a seamstress, maintaining her correspondence with women across multiple territories. She attended church services at the African Methodist Episcopal congregation, sang in the choir, lived a life that seemed almost aggressively normal, considering the chaos her trials had created. But she was also preparing. In the 18 months following her fourth acquittal, She began transferring her documents to a network of safe locations, churches, private homes, even a Creek Nation council house where a sympathetic delegate agreed to store a trunk of letters in tribal archives. She was creating redundancy, ensuring that even if one location was raided, the information would survive. She also began training others to continue the work. 3 women, 2 formerly enslaved, 1 freeborn, studied with her for months, learning not just the anatomy and legal strategies, but the careful documentation methods that made her archive valuable. They learned to write clearly and concisely, to preserve dates and details, to distinguish between rumor and verified fact. In December 1857, 2 federal marshals arrested Sarah on charges of mail fraud. The charge was technical, absurd on its face. They claimed she had been using the postal system to distribute information that endangered public safety. The evidence was thin, a few confiscated letters, testimony from a postmaster who admitted he had been pressured to monitor her correspondence. Everyone understood this was simply the latest attempt to silence her through legal mechanisms. This trial was different from the previous 4. Judge Patterson made clear from the opening that he would tolerate no lengthy testimonies about self-defense or systemic abuse. The question, he insisted, was simple. Had Sarah Granger violated federal postal regulations? Everything else was irrelevant. The trial lasted 2 days. The jury returned a guilty verdict in 40 minutes. Patterson sentenced her to 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to be followed by permanent exile from Oklahoma Territory. As marshals led her from the courtroom, Sarah turned and spoke directly to the gallery, her voice clear enough to carry to the back rows. "They can exile one woman. They cannot exile the knowledge I've shared. Remember that." Fort Leavenworth in 1858 was a military installation that doubled as a federal prison for the territories. Sarah arrived in January, shackled in a wagon with 3 other prisoners, and was assigned to the women's section, a limestone building that housed 17 women convicted of crimes ranging from theft to murder. The building itself told a story of institutional priorities. Built in 1847, the women's section occupied what had originally been a storage facility. 3 long rooms with small windows set high in the walls, designed more for ventilation than light. The limestone walls wept moisture in winter, creating a perpetual dampness that penetrated clothing, blankets, everything. In summer, the same walls held heat like an oven, making the cramped quarters almost unbearable. Each room housed 6 women sleeping on narrow wooden platforms with thin straw mattresses that harbored bedbugs and lice. The conditions were harsh but not intentionally cruel. Or rather, the cruelty was systemic rather than personal. The guards, a rotation of 3 men overseen by a matron named Mrs. Hale, treated the inmates with detached efficiency. They were not brutal, they simply enforced the rules with mechanical consistency: silence during work hours, single, file movement between buildings, no physical contact between inmates, mandatory attendance at all meals and religious services regardless of health or circumstance. Inmates worked in the laundry during the day, washing uniforms for the garrison. Hundreds of pounds of wool and cotton scrubbed by hand in scalding water, wrung out and hung to dry in all weather. The work destroyed hands and backs with democratic impartiality. Women who had never done manual labor before worked alongside those who had spent their lives in fields or factories. By the end of the first month, everyone's hands looked the same: cracked, bleeding, perpetually raw from the harsh soap and hot water. They were allowed to write letters, though all correspondence was read by guards before being sent. They attended mandatory church services on Sunday, led by a Methodist chaplain named Reverend Thomas Blackwell, who favored long sermons about repentance and redemption. His favorite theme was the concept of divine justice, how earthly punishments prepared the soul for heavenly salvation. He never looked directly at the inmates when he preached, instead fixing his gaze on a point slightly above their heads, as if addressing not the women themselves, but the sins they represented. Sarah adapted with the same calm precision she had brought to everything else in her life. She worked efficiently at the laundry tubs, her movements economical and practiced. She caused no trouble, responded to orders promptly, kept her thoughts to herself. The other inmates knew her reputation. Several had read about her trials in newspapers, and word traveled quickly in the confined quarters. But Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the stories. When asked directly by a woman named Catherine, a counterfeiter from St. Louis, Sarah simply said, "What I did for reasons that made sense at the time. What you've heard is probably close enough to the truth." The women's section developed its own social hierarchy, as all confined populations do. There were the politicals of women like Sarah, convicted of crimes that had ideological dimensions. There were the unfortunates, a women convicted of theft or prostitution, crimes of poverty rather than intent. And there were the dangers of 3 women convicted of murder who occupied a psychological space separate from the rest. The politicals and unfortunates mixed somewhat freely. The dangers were avoided when possible, their presence acknowledged only when absolutely necessary. Sarah found herself occupying an unusual position in this hierarchy. Her crimes were violent, which should have placed her among the dangers, but the specificity of her violence, the fact that it had been defensive rather than predatory, gave her a kind of respected distance. Women sought her out for advice, not about violence, but about navigation, how to endure, how to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away, how to hold on to yourself when the institution wanted you to disappear into your crime. She advised them with the same clarity she had brought to everything else. To the young women terrified of the years ahead, count days if it helps, or don't count them at all. Find a rhythm that makes time bearable rather than torturous. To the older women exhausted by repeated incarcerations, you know this system better than the guards do. Use that knowledge, be invisible when it serves you, visible when it protects you. To everyone, write letters, document everything. The only power we have is the power to be remembered accurately. What the authorities did not know was that Sarah had anticipated this outcome. Before her final trial, she had finished transferring all her documents to secure locations, and had trained her 3 successors thoroughly enough that they could continue the work without her guidance. The archive she had built was not dependent on her physical presence. It existed now in distributed form across 3 territories, in churches and private homes and tribal archives, copied and recopied by women who understood its value. One of her successors, Elizabeth, had managed to send a letter that reached Sarah in March, smuggled in through a network that involved a sympathetic laundress and a guard's wife who had abolitionist sympathies. The letter was brief, written in careful code that would not raise suspicion if intercepted. "The garden you planted continues to grow. We've harvested seeds and replanted them in new locations. The varieties you cultivated are flourishing in conditions you prepared them for. We tend them carefully and think of you with gratitude." Sarah read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the laundry's coal stove, watching the paper blacken and curl. The information was enough. Her work continued. That knowledge provided a kind of peace she had not expected to find within Fort Leavenworth's limestone walls. But imprisonment had provided something Sarah had not fully anticipated. Time to think, to reflect, to consider whether the path she had chosen had been worth the cost. In letters to her friends in Fort Gibson, letters the guards read but could not quite figure out how to censor, since they contained nothing explicitly illegal, she began to articulate a more complex understanding of her own actions. "I did what I believed necessary," she wrote to one friend in March 1858. "I would do it again given the same circumstances, but I wonder sometimes if I've become so focused on the immediate act of resistance that I've failed to imagine what might come after. Defending ourselves from assault is essential, but what comes next? How do we move from resistance to freedom? How do we build lives that don't require us to become dangerous in order to survive?" In another letter written in April, "The women here have taught me something unexpected. Many of them committed their crimes out of desperation rather than principle. A woman stole bread because her children were starving. Another killed a man who'd beaten her for years. Their stories remind me that resistance takes many forms, not all of them calculated or strategic. Sometimes survival itself is resistance. Sometimes just continuing to exist, refusing to be erased, is the most radical act possible. These letters circulated among her network, copied and discussed in quiet conversations. They revealed a Sarah Granger more thoughtful and conflicted than the figure who had emerged in court transcripts and newspaper accounts, not a simple heroine or villain, but a woman grappling with the consequences of her choices, trying to articulate a philosophy of resistance that went beyond her own specific circumstances. The prison routine had a numbing quality that some inmates found comforting and others found maddening. Wake at 5:30, breakfast of cornmeal mush and chicory coffee, work from 7 until noon. Lunch of bread and bean soup, work from 1 until 6. Dinner of more bread, occasionally with salt pork. Lights out at 8. Sunday varied only in the addition of 2 church services, morning and evening, that bracketed a day of enforced rest that felt more like extended confinement. Sarah marked time by the changes in light through the high windows, the way the angle of sun shifted across the laundry room floor as seasons progressed. Spring brought longer days and the smell of prairie grass through the small ventilation openings. Summer brought oppressive heat and the distant sound of military drills. Fall brought cooler air and the formation of geese overhead, their calls somehow reaching even into the stone building. Winter brought darkness and cold that penetrated everything. In July 1858, 6 months into her sentence, something unexpected happened. A group of women petitioned the territorial governor for Sarah's early release, arguing that she had been convicted on technical charges that would not have stood if the real goal had not been to silence her. The petition contained 127 signatures: white women, black women, Creek and Cherokee women, crossing racial and legal boundaries that rarely overlapped. The petition itself was a remarkable document, carefully worded to avoid inflammatory language while making its point clearly. It acknowledged that Sarah had been convicted of mail fraud, then systematically demonstrated why that conviction represented a miscarriage of justice. It noted that the postal regulations she had allegedly violated were inconsistently enforced, that dozens of people regularly used the mail system for similar purposes without prosecution. It pointed out that the trial had been unusually brief, that evidence of selective prosecution had been excluded, that the sentence was disproportionate to the offense.